I sat alone in my penthouse apartment, staring at my phone. The city lights stretched for miles outside my window, but they did nothing to quiet the thoughts in my head. I had spent years building a life most people could only dream about. I had employees, investors, and business partners who respected me. Strangers praised my success. Yet none of that filled the empty space left by my family. For a long time, I told myself I had moved on. I convinced myself that I didn't care what my parents thought anymore. But every holiday, every birthday, and every family gathering reminded me that something was still broken between us. A few days earlier, I had received an invitation to a family dinner. It wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that my mother had personally called to make sure I came. During the conversation, she spent nearly 20 minutes talking about Ethan. He was trying another business idea. He needed support. He needed encouragement. He needed money. Not once did she ask how I was doing. When the call ended, I sat there thinking about it. After everything that had happened over the years, would they ever treat me differently? Or was I still the same daughter they never believed in? The question stayed in my mind for days. That evening, I opened my contacts and found my father's number. My finger hovered over the screen. Part of me wanted to hang up before the call even started. Another part of me needed an answer. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Hello." His voice sounded distracted. I took a deep breath and forced myself to sound nervous. "Dad, I need some help." There was a brief silence. I explained that I was going through a difficult time and needed $150 for medicine. It wasn't a large amount. In fact, it was less than what many people spent on dinner. For a moment, I waited, hoping to hear concern in his voice. Hoping he would ask if I was okay. Hoping he would sound like a father. Instead, his response came quickly, and every word felt colder than the last. As I listened, I realized this phone call was about to give me the answer I had been searching for my entire life. The truth was, I had learned that lesson long before I became an adult. When I was growing up, I stopped expecting encouragement from my parents. It wasn't because I didn't try. For years, I did everything I could to make them proud. In middle school, I spent weeks preparing for a state academic competition. I studied every evening after school and worked harder than anyone else on my team. When I won second place, I came home excited to share the news. My father barely looked up from the television. "That's nice," he said. A few days later, Ethan scored a single goal during a local soccer game. My parents threw him a celebration dinner and invited relatives over to congratulate him. I remember sitting quietly at the table, wondering why my achievements never seemed important. As the years passed, the pattern never changed. When Ethan wanted a new laptop, he got one. When he wanted money for a hobby, my parents found a way to pay for it. When he lost interest and moved on to something else, nobody complained. Meanwhile, I learned not to ask for much. In high school, I wanted to attend a summer leadership program that could help with college admissions. The fee wasn't even that expensive, but my father immediately rejected the idea. "We don't have money for things like that," he said. A month later, he spent several times that amount helping Ethan buy equipment for another short-lived project. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the message behind it. They believed Ethan's dreams were worth investing in. Mine weren't. By my senior year, I was handling everything myself. I researched colleges alone. I filled out applications alone. I searched for scholarships alone. Whenever I brought up my future, my parents seemed uninterested. My mother would usually change the subject and start talking about Ethan instead. At family gatherings, relatives often asked what I planned to do after graduation. Before I could answer, someone would start discussing Ethan's latest goal or idea. After a while, I stopped speaking up. I began to understand something that took years to accept. No matter how hard I worked, I wasn't competing against failure. I was competing against favoritism. And favoritism always wins. As graduation approached, acceptance letters started arriving. Some came from excellent universities. Instead of feeling excited, I felt strangely calm. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about making my parents proud. I was thinking about building a future that didn't depend on them at all. That thought scared me. But deep down, it also felt like freedom. A few weeks after graduation, I packed everything I owned into my old car and left. There was no emotional goodbye. No family gathering. No words of encouragement. My parents stood on the front porch while I loaded my bags. My mother gave me a brief hug. My father simply nodded and went back inside. That was it. I drove away knowing that whatever happened next would be entirely up to me. College was much harder than I expected. The scholarships covered part of my expenses, but not everything. Rent, books, food, and transportation quickly added up. To survive, I took every job I could find. Before morning classes, I worked at a coffee shop. In the evenings, I stocked shelves at a grocery store. On weekends, I picked up extra shifts wherever I could. Most days started before sunrise and ended long after dark. I was constantly tired. There were times when I sat in class struggling to stay awake because I had only slept a few hours the night before. Then things got worse. During my second year, my landlord raised the rent. I couldn't afford the increase. After paying tuition and other bills, there simply wasn't enough money left. For several weeks, I slept in my car. I parked in different locations each night so nobody would notice. I kept a blanket in the back seat and used public restrooms to get ready for class in the morning. Those were some of the hardest days of my life. There were evenings when dinner consisted of $1 sandwich and a bottle of water. Sometimes I told myself things would get better. Other times, I wasn't so sure. What surprised me most was the silence. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. My phone rarely rang. No one asked where I was living. No one asked if I had enough food. No one checked whether I was struggling. Eventually, I stopped expecting those calls. Instead, I focused on what I could control. Every challenge taught me something. Every setback forced me to become stronger. I learned how to manage money carefully. I learned how to solve problems on my own. I learned that waiting for someone to rescue me was a waste of time. Little by little, my mindset changed. I stopped seeing myself as the forgotten daughter. I started seeing myself as someone capable of building her own future. One cold night, sitting alone in my car after another long shift, I made a promise to myself. I would never allow my life to be defined by rejection. One day, I would create something meaningful. One day, I would build a future so strong that nobody could take it away from me. And when that day came, I would know that I earned every piece of it myself. The promise I made to myself became the reason I kept moving forward. After college, I accepted an entry-level position at a consulting firm. The pay wasn't impressive, but it gave me something valuable: experience. I paid close attention to how businesses operated, how leaders made decisions, and where companies struggled the most. Over the next few years, I worked harder than anyone around me. I arrived early, stayed late, and volunteered for projects that others avoided. Slowly, I earned promotions and built a reputation as someone who could solve difficult problems. One issue kept appearing everywhere I worked. Many companies were wasting huge amounts of time because their internal systems were outdated and inefficient. Employees spent hours completing tasks that should have taken minutes. The more I studied the problem, the more I realized there was a business opportunity. Eventually, I decided to take a risk. I left my stable job and started my own company. At first, it was just me working from a small rented office with a second-hand desk and an old laptop. I couldn't afford a large staff, so I handled everything myself. Sales, customer service, meetings, and planning all fell on my shoulders. The first year was difficult. Some months I barely made enough money to cover expenses. Several potential clients turned me down. A few people even told me my idea would never work. But unlike before, those words no longer discouraged me. I had heard doubt my entire life. I knew how to keep going. Gradually, things started changing. One company became a client, then another. Satisfied customers recommended my services to others. Soon, contracts became larger and opportunities became more frequent. By the 5th year, my company had expanded into multiple states. By the 7th year, major corporations were signing agreements with us. Investors began reaching out, wanting to become part of the business. The company grew faster than I ever imagined. New offices opened across the country. Hundreds of employees joined the organization. Revenue climbed year after year. The small office I once struggled to afford was replaced by a national company serving businesses across America. For the first time in my life, financial worries disappeared. I could buy anything I wanted. I could travel anywhere I chose. I had achieved every goal I once thought was impossible. Yet there was one thing success couldn't fix. Every now and then, I would receive a family update from a relative. Whenever my name came up, the conversations were strangely brief. There was no pride, no excitement, no acknowledgement of what I had built. After everything I accomplished, I still felt like the daughter nobody noticed. The business was thriving. My future was secure. But deep inside, one question remained unanswered. Why was it still so difficult for my own parents to see my worth? Over the years, I learned more about Ethan's life through relatives than through my parents. Every few months, there seemed to be a new plan. One year he wanted to open a restaurant. The next year he wanted to launch a clothing brand. Then it was real estate. Then online sales. Then another business that nobody fully understood. Each idea was introduced as if it would change his life forever. And each one ended the same way. The money disappeared. The project failed. Someone else was blamed. Then the cycle started again. What amazed me wasn't Ethan's behavior. It was my parents' reaction every single time. No matter how many mistakes he made, they always found a way to protect him. If he needed money, they gave it. If he created debt, they paid it. If he made poor decisions, they defended him. Nothing was ever his responsibility. According to my parents, he was simply unlucky. Meanwhile, family members constantly talked about how much stress Ethan was causing. My father delayed retirement plans more than once because of financial help he provided. My mother worried constantly about bills and expenses. Yet neither of them ever considered saying no. During one family gathering, I watched the situation unfold right in front of me. Several relatives were sitting around the dinner table discussing Ethan's latest failed venture. The losses were significant, and everyone knew it. Still, my father spoke about him as if success was just around the corner. "He just needs one good opportunity," he said confidently. Everyone nodded. Then someone asked about my work. Before I could answer, the conversation shifted back to Ethan. Within seconds, I was invisible again. I sat there quietly, listening as people discussed his future for nearly an hour. No one seemed interested in mine. The moment stayed with me long after the dinner ended. It wasn't jealousy. I wasn't upset because Ethan received attention. I was hurt because no matter what happened, the rules were always different for him. He could fail repeatedly and still be celebrated. I could succeed beyond anyone's expectations and still be ignored. That realization became harder to accept as the years passed. I tried to be understanding. I told myself parents sometimes make mistakes. I told myself they didn't mean to treat us differently. But every family event made the truth impossible to ignore. The favoritism hadn't ended when we became adults. If anything, it had become even more obvious. What made it worse was watching my parents sacrifice their own security to keep rescuing Ethan. The more they gave, the more he expected. The more he expected, the deeper the problems became. And through all of it, they continued acting as though he was the center of the family, while I stood somewhere on the outside looking in. No matter how much I tried to move past it, the resentment kept growing. And soon, something would happen that forced me to stop pretending everything was fine. The conversation with my father stayed in my mind long after the call ended. I sat in silence, staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to believe I had misunderstood him. Maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe there was another explanation. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. For a brief moment, I thought she might be calling because she was concerned. Maybe she wanted to ask about my situation. Maybe she wanted to know if I was okay. Instead, her first question was about money. Not for me. For Ethan. She started talking about how difficult things had been for him recently. According to her, he had run into another business problem and needed help getting back on his feet. I listened quietly. The more she talked, the clearer everything became. She mentioned that they had already given him several $1,000s earlier that week. They were hoping it would help solve his latest financial mess. I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. Just minutes earlier, I had been told that $150 was too much to ask for. Now I was learning that thousands had been handed to Ethan without hesitation. My mother continued explaining the situation as if it were completely normal. She didn't realize what she was revealing. She didn't know I was comparing every word to the conversation I had just had with my father. Finally, I asked a simple question. If Ethan called asking for $150 for medicine, would you help him? There was a short pause. Then she laughed softly. Of course we would. The answer came so naturally that it almost hurt more than anything else. There was no hesitation, no debate, no lecture about responsibility, no accusations. The rules were completely different. For the first time in my life, I stopped looking for excuses. I stopped telling myself they didn't realize what they were doing. I stopped believing things would change someday. The truth was sitting right in front of me. If Ethan needed help, my parents found a way. If I needed help, I became a burden. It had always been that way. The test wasn't really about money. I never needed the $150. What I needed was clarity. And now I finally had it. After ending the call, I walked across my apartment and looked out the window. The city below was busy with people living their lives. For years, I had carried a small amount of hope that my parents might eventually see me differently. That hope disappeared that night. Not in anger. Not in sadness. Just acceptance. For the first time, I saw the situation exactly as it was. And once I accepted the truth, something inside me changed. I no longer wanted their approval. I no longer needed their validation. What I didn't realize then was that an even bigger betrayal was waiting just around the corner. A few weeks after those phone calls, I attended a family gathering for one of my cousins. I almost didn't go. Over the years, those events had become uncomfortable, and I usually kept my visits short. But my cousin had personally invited me, so I decided to show up. At first, everything seemed normal. People were eating, talking, and catching up with one another. I spent most of my time speaking with relatives I hadn't seen in years. Then something strange started happening. Several family members asked questions that didn't make sense. One aunt pulled me aside and quietly asked if I was having financial problems. A few minutes later, an uncle asked whether I had found a stable career yet. Another relative offered advice about saving money and finding better opportunities. I was confused. None of them knew anything about my actual life. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. But as the evening continued, I noticed a pattern. Many of them seemed to believe I was struggling. Some looked at me with sympathy. Others looked disappointed. Eventually, one of my cousins sat down beside me and explained what had been happening. For years, my parents had been telling people a very different version of my story. According to them, I had never really found success. They claimed I was constantly facing setbacks and making poor career choices. Meanwhile, they described Ethan as someone with enormous potential who was destined for great things. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was one thing for my parents to ignore my accomplishments. It was another thing entirely for them to erase them. Suddenly, dozens of awkward conversations from previous years made sense. People weren't judging me based on facts. They were judging me based on what they had been told. The realization was painful. Not because strangers believed those stories, but because the stories came from my own parents. The people who should have been proud of me had spent years creating a false image of who I was. As the evening went on, I found myself watching my parents from across the room. They laughed with relatives and spoke proudly about Ethan's latest plans. No one mentioned the businesses I had built. No one mentioned the hundreds of employees working for my company. No one mentioned the life I had created from nothing. For the first time, I stopped feeling hurt. Instead, I felt something else. Clarity. I finally understood that I had been chasing something I was never going to receive. Their approval wasn't waiting around the corner. It wasn't coming next year. It wasn't coming ever. That night, I left the gathering with a decision. I was done trying to prove my worth to people who had already chosen not to see it. And soon, life would give them a reason to finally face the truth. A few months after that family gathering, things started falling apart for Ethan. At first, I only heard small pieces of information through relatives. Then the phone calls began. One cousin mentioned that Ethan owed money to several lenders. An uncle said there were legal problems connected to one of his failed business deals. Another relative hinted that the situation was becoming serious. The details were different, but the message was always the same. The family was in trouble. As more information came out, the picture became clearer. Over the years, my parents had continued helping Ethan financially. They had borrowed against savings, emptied accounts, and made sacrifices they could not afford. Instead of solving his problems, the money only delayed them. Now everything was catching up at once. The debts had become too large to ignore. The pressure was affecting everyone. For the first time, relatives stopped talking about Ethan's potential and started talking about consequences. Then something unexpected happened. One of my distant relatives attended a business conference in Chicago. While there, he saw me speaking at an event. He recognized my name immediately. A few days later, he began asking questions. Within weeks, the truth spread throughout the family. People discovered the company I owned. They learned about the size of the business. They learned about the success I had achieved over the years. Suddenly, the same relatives who once believed I was struggling saw a completely different reality. My phone started ringing more often. Some calls came from people I had not spoken to in years. Others came from family members who had barely acknowledged me at previous gatherings. The conversations always started the same way. They asked how I was doing. They acted friendly. Then they slowly shifted toward discussing Ethan and the family's financial situation. It wasn't difficult to understand what they wanted. Eventually, my mother called. For the first time in a very long time, she sounded unusually warm. She asked about my life. She asked about my work. She even told me she missed me. The conversation felt strange. Not because of what she said, because of how different it was from every conversation we had shared for years. A few days later, my father called too. His tone was polite, respectful, almost careful. By the end of the conversation, he finally mentioned the financial problems. The request wasn't direct, but the meaning was obvious. They expected me to help. They expected me to step in and solve everything. As if the past had never happened. As if years of rejection could simply be forgotten. As if I would immediately rescue the people who had spent most of my life treating me like an outsider. When the calls ended, I sat quietly thinking about everything. For years, they had held the power in our relationship. They decided who mattered. They decided who received support. They decided whose future was worth believing in. Now the situation had completely changed. And for the very first time, the decision belonged to me. After the calls, I did not respond right away. For a few days, I stayed quiet and observed everything from a distance. Messages kept coming in. Some were polite. Some were urgent. Some tried to sound emotional, as if time had suddenly erased everything that had happened before. I read them all, but I didn't reply. Instead, I made a simple decision. If they wanted answers, they would get them face to face. I arranged a private meeting at a neutral place. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. Just a quiet conference room where everything could be said clearly without interruption. When the day arrived, they all came. My father walked in first, looking serious but tired. My mother followed him, holding her bag tightly. Other relatives arrived after them, filling the room with uneasy silence. Ethan came last. No one spoke much at the beginning. They waited, expecting me to start the conversation. I didn't rush. I placed a folder on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were records, reports, milestones, proof of everything I had built over the years. I started speaking in a calm voice. I explained how I had worked from nothing, step by step, without help from anyone in that room. I showed them how the company began with small clients and grew into something much larger. I pointed out numbers, contracts, and achievements they had never asked about. No one interrupted me. Then I brought up the past, not with emotion, but with clarity. I reminded them of moments they had dismissed my efforts. I spoke about how support had always gone in one direction. I mentioned the times I was told I couldn't be helped, even for basic needs. The room grew heavier with each sentence. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply showed the pattern that had always existed. Then I closed the folder. I looked at them and said I would not be covering Ethan's debts. There was a long silence. My mother looked shocked. My father tried to respond, but stopped halfway. Ethan looked away. Someone in the room tried to argue, but there was no space left for excuses. I explained that every choice had consequences, and those consequences belonged to the people who made them. Not me. For the first time, I wasn't asking for approval or understanding. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I was simply standing by the life I had already built. The conversation ended without shouting, without drama, without emotional collapse. Just truth. And truth, for the first time, was enough. After that meeting, nothing stayed the same. People did not argue loudly or create a scene. Instead, they left in silence, each carrying their own thoughts. The truth had been spoken so clearly that there was nothing left to twist or explain away. In the days that followed, I stayed in my own space and focused on work. I expected more calls, more pressure, and more attempts to change my mind. But the tone of those messages slowly shifted. Some stopped completely. Others became shorter and more careful. It was as if everyone was finally seeing the situation without filters. My relatives who had once believed only one version of the story began to understand how much had been hidden. They no longer spoke with assumptions. Instead, they asked questions with caution, as if afraid of being wrong again. Richard and Diane were no longer defended by easy excuses. Their choices were now visible to everyone around them. People who once agreed with them started to rethink everything they had been told over the years. Ethan also changed after that day. For the first time, he could not rely on promises or expectations. There was no one stepping in to fix things for him anymore. He had to face the results of his own decisions without support from others. It was not loud or dramatic. It was just reality settling in. As for me, I kept moving forward. Work became steady again. Meetings, planning, and growth continued like before. But something inside me had shifted permanently. I no longer waited for approval from anyone in my family. I no longer measured my worth through their reactions or opinions. That part of my life had finally closed. There was no need for anger anymore. No need for arguments. No need to prove anything further. What had once felt like a wound slowly turned into distance. Not painful distance, but quiet distance that brought clarity. I understood that success had never been the real revenge. It was simply the result of refusing to give up. Everything I built stood on its own. No one could take credit for it, and no one could erase it. The labels I grew up with no longer defined me. The expectations that once held me back no longer mattered. In the end, the family learned what favoritism costs. Not through shouting or punishment, but through consequences that could not be undone. And I learned something even more important. That walking away from approval can sometimes feel like loss at first, but it eventually becomes freedom. I did not need to win against anyone. I only needed to keep building my own life. And that was enough.